Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant are now wanted by the International Criminal Court as word comes of arrest warrants issued for both of them. We'll talk about that. Plus conversation with the much admired commentator on the Middle East, Tom Friedman of the New York Times, and something special from one of the most acclaimed journalists in Israel, Ilana Dayan, giving a speech that is striking. It's unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. Unholy two Jews on the news as we, sort of open our mouth and open the microphones. The news hit that the ICC issues arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant for alleged war crimes in Gaza. I mean, that just happened. So let's talk about that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, they also clumped together Mohammed Def in that decision.
Yeah, they did.
Arrest warrants sent by Ouija board, I guess.
It's very odd look, we're just reacting to this, you and I both now in sort of real time because it has just happened. Yep. But when the arrest warrants were requested by the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court back in May, there were named then the current defense minister, he's since left the job, Yoav Gallant, and the Prime Minister Netanyahu, but also Hamas leadership, namely Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Deif, and Ismail Haniyeh. Now, all three of those people, as far as everyone else knows, are dead. But the ICC in issuing these warrants now has named, yes, Gallant and Netanyahu, but also Deif. It's eliminated from their sort of inquiries, as it were, Haniyeh and Sinwar, as if they accept that those two are dead. Perhaps they think there is some question mark over the death of Mohammed Deif, one of the commanders of Hamas. So that is, on its face, mysterious. Maybe there is some confusion there. But obviously the thing that will get headlines everywhere, and is the thing that we're reacting to, are the live prosecutions that are these two now wanted men, Netanyahu and Gallant. I mean, my first reaction to this is about the timing. Was there a calculation in The Hague at the ICC that they had to do this now because if they did not, there would be intense pressure from a Trump administration to block these warrants being issued? The jurisdictional issues are such that the ICC can sort of do what it likes anyway, but this is politics as well as law, and there would be pressure. I'm not convinced the Biden administration wouldn't have put pressure anyway, but perhaps the ICC have made a calculation there about the change in administration in Washington. I'm sure we'll be told, no, this was just the same legal process. But at the very least, there will be a lot of speculation and assumption that politics has played a role here.
When these warrants were only considered back in May, the Biden administration said that it was outrageous. And a lot of the criticism had to do with the clumping together of Sinwar, Mohammed Deif, Ismail Haniyeh, the architects of the worst massacre against Jews since the Holocaust, and the elected leaders of a government in a country. So obviously that was what a lot of people marked at the time. This is a huge deal. You have a carpet condemnation of politicians. Again, this just happened. So politicians from the whole range of Israeli politics saying this is an outrage, saying this is, a moral depravity, basically, of doing this. And Israel is not, nor Netanyahu or Yoav Gallant, who's not the defense minister anymore, we should say, not having his best month, are not guilty of these crimes. But again, this is a terrible news for Israel. No question about that.
Yeah, so in the immediate effect is on the freedom of movement to travel of the two wanted men, as they now are, Netanyahu and Gallant. There will be a lot of countries that will not welcome them, and because the obligations, if you are a signatory to the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court, the legal obligation is that if somebody wanted by the ICC steps onto your territory, you must facilitate their arrest. You have to hand them over to the judgment of the court. So there is a whole lot of countries that will not want to defy that. I'm thinking of Europe. I'm thinking perhaps of Britain. The United States, maybe not. Would a Trump-governed United States would defy it. There were even conversations about would the Prime Minister of Israel be able to travel to the United States if that meant going over airspace of countries that are adherent to the court. So this is going to really complicate the life of these two individuals. The wider point, I think, is it goes to the isolation of Israel. I think we're going to hear later on our conversation with Tom Friedman, his fears about Israel being a kind of pariah nation. This makes that formal in a way, that if the prime minister of the country is not wanted in large parts of the world, that is a huge form of isolation. One last thing that I'm bound to say is that I'm just looking at reports of this saying that the ICC document says there were or are reasonable grounds, in quotes, to believe that Netanyahu and Gallant committed war crimes, and said that among the crimes alleged are the use of starvation as a tool of war. We are back to something we talked about a lot on the podcast. I know a lot of people didn't want to hear it, but my fear from the beginning was about humanitarian aid, that I thought that was going to be a huge problem for Israel. That's I had many reasons for saying that. But one of the points legally, I've since spoken to sort of legal scholars about this, it is very hard to prove, war crimes in terms of the conduct of war. This bombing, that airstrike, very, very difficult, because there's all kinds of tests of proportionality in which you have to prove that the military gain was not worth the loss of life. That is very, very difficult. But humanitarian suffering, the notion of people just not getting enough food or water or medicine, that is a much easier case to make legally. And so that was always, the huge danger that Israel was courting. And this was a danger that was clear very, very early on. I remember, you and I talked about it in October of 2023. Case I was trying to make was, yes, fight this war against Hamas to defeat Hamas, but you are taking a huge risk by not getting full aid and food and water and medicine into the people of Gaza. Your battle is against Hamas, not the Palestinians there. It wasn't that top of my mind was a war crimes prosecution, but here it now is.
So I would say, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time that warrants are issued for leaders in a democratic country. I don't remember another case. Maybe you can remind me if there was. There's an issue here that we discussed back in May as well, and that's the issue of the principle of complementarity, which means that if you believe that the country has an independent, impartial judicial process, you wouldn't do this. And what many people advised Netanyahu was, listen, you have to set up a commission of inquiry on these matters, and maybe that will convince the court. He didn't do that. So that is another point to say, right, in this case. I would say, again, I think many Israelis would feel and think and say, and indeed this is what was happening right in the minutes that we're discussing this, that this is outrageous.
I think you make such a good point about the State Commission of Inquiry. Again, that's a point we're going to hear more from later on in the podcast from Ilana Dayan. That was really, I think the court more or less said it as clearly as they could. If you yourself take action, then this is a different story. And you've given us the legal framework for that, this notion of complementarity. I think that is a crucial point. In terms of precedent, I don't know of one exactly in the democratic world. Russia, Vladimir Putin is an indicted war criminal in the eyes of the ICC. Russia, obviously not a democracy. There were the tribunals against, Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia. That was a different case because it was under a separate kind of distinct tribunal that was established specifically to investigate the wars in the Balkans. So, look, there may be other cases that are not immediately coming to mind. As we've said, we're reacting to this as it's happening. So this is certainly for Israel uncharted territory. It confirms what has been a theme of the last year: the gradual political isolation of Israel, which is very sometimes easy to miss because obviously in the United States, you've had one, in my eyes, extremely pro-Israel administration now going to be replaced by one that is currently explicitly planning to be even more, as it were, pro-Israel. So that, if you're just looking towards America, you're sitting in Israel, you think, what isolation? But in terms of the other institutions of the world, this ostracism of Israel is gathering pace, and this is a legal expression of that, I think.
Yes, and I think terrorists around the world who have been taking notes since October 7th would probably pride themselves on taking notes indeed in the fact that the one thing to do if you're a terror organization is embed yourself in civilization and among other innocent civilians. Thus, if you attack or perpetrate this kind of attack, you know that your civilians will be hurt, and this is the outcome of it. So that is also something said, that fighting this kind of war is probably impossible in the climate that we live in, and in a reality in which cameras are literally everywhere. And, that is what we are saying. Just another afterthought.
No doubt at all that Hamas set a kind of wicked trap for Israel. Mm-hmm. I'm afraid they, my view, said at the time, that Netanyahu did then walk into that trap. But no doubt at all that there is a moral culpability for those who laid the trap, but there was a decision there made to walk into it, and I think particularly in the form of denying essential services to the civilian population. I think, we've argued over it many times, and I know Israel say that we did. Israel's official position is that, we sent tons of aid in, and of course it all got looted, and we've seen that just in the last few days. Nevertheless, I think Israel needed to go over and above the necessity of duty, as it were, to show the world that it was fighting Hamas, not the civilian population. And maybe they could have avoided this legal case if they had done that. But that horse has bolted.
It does look, as we sit here on Thursday afternoon, that a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah is closer than ever. The defense echelon in this country thinks that Israeli successes in weakening Hezbollah merit a pause in this war that essentially has been, going on since October 8th, when Hezbollah began shooting rockets, launching them towards Israel. You saw Biden's envoy, Amos Hochstein, saying in Beirut this week on Tuesday, we have a real opportunity to bring this conflict to an end. This is a moment of decision-making. And in my mind, he was talking to an audience of one, that one person being Benjamin Netanyahu, who has to make a decision. Again, we are in that reality in which there is a political base and a coalition that needs to, that pressures the prime minister. Specifically in the issue of Lebanon, I should say, none of his right-wing ministers who threatened to leave the coalition if he ends the war in Gaza have been threatening him in this case, in the Lebanon case. But it does seem like the right-wing pro-Netanyahu base is boiling over this issue of Lebanon. They were promised a victory. They thought maybe there would be a security zone between Lebanon and Israel, and maybe there would be a written agreement saying that Israel can act if Hezbollah breaks the deal. That is not going to be the case. So there has been this sort of murmur, and we have to be very attuned to it, because if that grows, then Netanyahu will have a very big issue in ending this war. And as always, peace in the Middle East, or at least an agreement in the Middle East, is like the horizon, right? The more you move closer to it, the more it recedes. So that is where we are at this point. It does seem close, but it isn't over yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You've just articulated exactly my instinctive feeling about this, which is I'm not holding my breath. Even if everyone says it's coming, I'll wait till I see it. As Ronald Reagan used to say, trust, but verify. And, we'll wait till that's verified. The situation is obviously different in this case than the Gaza case in every way. For example, I don't think, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but even the far right in Israel are talking about settling in southern Lebanon in the way that they have designs on Gaza. You have in Hezbollah a player that has other pressures on it from other political actors in Lebanon, that their patience has worn very thin with Hezbollah as the sort of guest that outstays its welcome and has just brought trouble upon it. There were no other actors that Hamas had to consider that we're ever putting pressure on it to sort of do a deal, because they're just, Hamas was the dominant force in Gaza. So there are just those kinds of differences, and that Israel really, has sort of said what it needed to say and is now ready to come out. But what you've said is fascinating, that there is pressure from the right even on that one, because the conventional wisdom had been that the Ben Gvirs and Smotriches of this world, while absolutely on Netanyahu's case about not ending the war in Gaza, had more or less given him a free hand to end the conflict with Hezbollah. So you've put an interesting qualifier on that I think many people won't have heard.
Right. And I think, again, we should still make the distinction between the fact that Smotrich and Ben Gvir are not threatening him in the Lebanon case, but you do see that sort of undercurrent of Netanyahu's political base, saying, why are we ending this war? We have not yet achieved what we need to achieve. So that is where we are on the Lebanon story. I think in the meantime, we should say that the walls are beginning to inch in on Netanyahu internally. So I'll just point out a few things. This is even, we're having this conversation after the warrants coming out from the ICC. I think that's probably a bigger deal for him. But let's say what has been happening here in the past week here in Israel. So first of all, investigations against Netanyahu's advisors in that story that we've been talking about, the stealing of classified documents, leaking them to international media, that is intensifying. More of his advisors have been investigated. We should just note that this investigation is under the jurisdiction of the Shin Bet, the General Security Service. I will go back to that in a minute. Netanyahu himself trying to postpone his own trial, and the judges are refusing that. Haaretz also reported this week that Netanyahu's office asked Shin Bet's security agency to say that for security reasons, he can't give a long testimony where people publicly know where he is. And the Shin Bet refused. And the third thing that's happening, of course, garnered a lot of headlines this week, a severe incident in which flash bombs were being thrown at Netanyahu's house in Caesarea. 3 Israelis were arrested over this. This happens, I remind you, after at the end of October, Hezbollah sent drones to his house in Caesarea. Even if you are a very level-headed person, you might try and, be a little bit trepidatious after these 2 events happen. Why am I giving you this longest exposition in the history of podcasts is to say that what happened consequently after all of what I just described is that circle around Netanyahu began to leak that his next plan is to indeed fire the attorney general and fire the head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar. If that happens, and I don't know if that was more a trial balloon than Netanyahu actually considering it, if he is considering it, is the boldest move he has done so far, perhaps emboldened by, Trump's unbound inspiration. But if he does indeed do that, that will be a completely different story in Israel.
Yeah. So it's a good way of looking at these things so often is there's the first level, which you'd think there's Netanyahu in peril. He's encircled. He's got The Hague. He's got legal challenges from within, his corruption trials ongoing, even this direct threats against his home. You take sort of 2 steps back and you think on some level politically he's stronger than he's been since October the 7th. I mean, he's got rid of Gallant. He's got a sycophant yes man in there now as defense minister. And this warrant from The Hague actually probably helps him politically, because domestically to his audience, to his base, he can say, there's the outside world accusing us of outrageous things. And I'm standing there as the symbol of all of you. And so this will actually plays to him, much as we've seen with Trump. When there are warrants and charges against him, it only made him stronger with his own base. And he will only, if he does make this move that you just mentioned there against the Attorney General, it's because he feels that politically he has got more strength now than he had before. We might mention that he went this week actually into Gaza to issue this promise to offer this $5 million reward for the return of hostages. There was some commentary that this was the opening shot of his re-election campaign, that he's actually already now positioning with Gallant away off his back. He's now positioning himself as the guy who's standing firm, and there he is in Gaza, having seen off the threat and so on. This is how he rolls. That actually, much like Trump, what would make other politicians weaker or more imperiled, he can turn them to his advantage. And I think he will be doing that with a few of these moves this week. I mean, Norway asking the International Court of Justice to issue an advisory opinion on Israel's judgment about UNRWA, the Palestinian Relief and Works Agency. All of this stuff, the idea that it's us against the world and I stand there for you, that actually helps Netanyahu politically.
I completely agree that he is emboldened by a lot of it. Look, firing the attorney general, who is, we should say in Israel, also the head of the public prosecution, when you are a prime minister indicted and standing on trial, that conflict of interest is so loud, no earmuff in the world would dim the sound, right? And to say nothing of the fact that if you fire the head of Shin Bet, who's actually investigating people, employers who are your advisors, again, conflict of interest, reasonability, we can go into all that. It's an extreme move. it's very hard in the Netanyahu world to know if these things are, again, a smokescreen to, move that public focus to that instead of, his political woes. This has been the story everyone has been talking about up until this point, where I assume everyone will be now talking about the ICC.
So obviously these are the preoccupations of this week in the news, but just taking a couple of steps back, there have been some big changes in the recent period with the arrival imminently of a new administration. What does that mean for the prospects in the medium and much longer term for Israel, for the wider Middle East? We thought we would have that conversation with someone who knows this subject better than most.
And we should say that this conversation happened literally minutes before the ICC decision dropped.
Thomas L. Friedman is the must-read foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times and has been in that position for several decades, the author of many best-selling books, including, and now out in a new updated edition, the definitive From Beirut to Jerusalem. I am not the only journalist who was schooled by that volume. Tom Friedman, extremely good to have you back with us on Unholy.
Great to be with you guys.
So, Tom, I know you are back from a visit to the region. You go all the time, but you've just come back from Israel. I think you're also in the United Arab Emirates. And you came back with a column that, not for the first time, lots of people are talking about, saying that Donald Trump can make some unexpected history. It's up to him. You begin, though, with this observation that there are two Donald Trumps and that creates a great opportunity. Just explain to us what you mean by the two Donald Trumps and why that could be a good thing.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I was really getting at, Johnny, the fact that he came out of the box on the Middle East. One of his very first appointments was to name his ambassador to Israel, which is quite unusual. I mean, before he named his defense secretary or even secretary of state, I believe. Mike Huckabee, a former governor of Arkansas, and evangelical, Christian who does not actually believe that Israel is occupying the West Bank. He refers to it as Judea and Samaria, and is on record favoring Israel annexing the West Bank. And that Donald Trump, who appointed that man, would be appointing someone who would basically be taking the U.S. and Israel down a path that I think could actually lead to the unraveling of the Abraham Accords, after all, which were premised on the notion that Israel would not annex the West Bank. But there is another Donald Trump, for those of us who covered him before, specifically in the Middle East, who laid down the first plan for a two-state solution between Israelis and Palestinians since the Clinton parameters laid down by President Bill Clinton. And it's not the plan I would have laid down. It actually called for Israel to annex 30% of the West Bank, for the Palestinians to have a state on the other 70% roughly. No Israeli settlements would be moved. Palestinians would have a capital outside of Jerusalem. And Gaza, though, would be expanded with a territory carved out of Israel's Negev desert, and there would be roads and tunnels connecting Gaza to the West Bank. It's actually a pretty remarkable plan. And again, the parameters are not where I would have liked them. It was drawn up without any input from Palestinians because they refused to participate. It was drawn up by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And what I was advocating is that if the president really wanted to make history, he would dust off his plan. By the way, if you dust that plan off, Yonit and Johnny, what you find is there's fingerprints on it. And the fingerprints are of Benjamin Netanyahu and Ron Dermer, who actually played an instrumental role in drawing up the plan. And so what I was advocating is that President Trump bring out that plan and say to both sides, you're invited to Camp David, and the ticket to price for admission is embracing the Trump plan not as a ceiling, but as a floor of negotiations. This is where you'll start. Where the two of you go from here, up to you, but this will be the starting point. And so I was just reminding him and my readers that this was there. And I was also making the point that one of the great, I think, failures of the Biden administration was they never put out their own plan. And the reason that became important was because when Israel launched its invasion of Gaza, it was going to kill a lot of civilians if it had taken the most extreme care. which it didn't, but if it had taken the most extreme care, because Hamas had nested itself in mosques and hospitals and in urban areas, and there was no way to eradicate it without killing civilians inadvertently. And so to create a moral framework around that, I thought from the very beginning, and I argued this, it was important for Israel to basically have its own plan for the morning after that made clear that it was trying to defeat and dismantle Hamas in order to install and partner with a Palestinian partner, the Palestinian Authority, that embraced the Oslo Peace Treaty. It's one thing to kill 43,000 people, maybe 2/3 of them civilians, with a plan that says we're doing this for a better future. And it's one to do it with no plan. And I think that's hurt Israel. But the collateral damage was the Biden administration, because it kept giving Israel the arms to pursue this policy that was inevitably going to kill civilians, but with no plan for the morning after. And I was basically saying to Trump, don't fall into that mode, because I think it's bad for American interests. So that's what I was up to.
But the question is right now, right after Hamas perpetrated the worst massacre against Israeli civilians in the history of this country, and this country obviously still reeling from what had happened on October 7th. You saw this and felt it when you were here. You talk about, there's this is quoting from your piece, there is enormous opportunity and appetite for a game-changing deal. Is there an appetite? I mean, I'm not even talking about the American side. Before we get to that, can Israelis do it? Do they want to? Can Palestinians do it?
Yeah, very important and valid question, Yonit. My philosophy in covering this story from the very beginning has been, I won't talk about the problem. I'll only talk about the solution. Somebody has to, and that was the role I assigned myself. But you're saying, yeah, that sounds great, Tom, but there is a problem. It's been a traumatic experience for Israelis, traumatic experience for Palestinians, and I recognize that. But the history of Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been after other traumas, the 1973 war, Intifada 1, Intifada 2, we always had a peace process again. I mean, people at the end of the day come back to the fact that we have two indigenous people who claim the same land, and they've got to find a way, or they've got to attempt to find a way to live together. And so I didn't imagine this, Yonit, as tomorrow or next week. I think it could only be a starter for a conversation after a ceasefire in Gaza in which Israeli hostages are returned. Because I think only then will Israelis be able to step back and think about where they want to go from here. We may even have an election and a new government. I would point out, though, that from a purely Israeli point of view, I don't have to tell you, Yonit, no reporters have been allowed to go into Gaza except escorted by the Israeli army. So the exposure of the world that what has gone on in Gaza is actually fairly limited. There will be a day where Gaza will be reopened. I don't know when. And I think the pictures of that will be horrifying. 80% of the housing stock destroyed. And we're going into winter as well. And for all those reasons, and I'm not trying to do PR for Israel, I'm trying to settle, to contribute ideas to solving these things. I do think it's very important to have a plan for the morning after that frames the context here that there's a way out for Israelis and Palestinians. And so I understand both sides are deeply traumatized, but somebody's got to be out there talking about the morning after. And given the fact that Israel is a government that refuses to and managed to, persuade my government not to, well, that's why God invented columnists. That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, no, I think it's a public service that you're doing it. I mean, you mentioned there that it's a floor, not a ceiling. I mean, just as one example, the Trump plan as originally conceived envisaged an expanded Gaza, that it would grow because of land swapped out of the Negev. And I just think when you make your point about appetite, I'm wondering how many Israelis have appetite for a bigger Gaza. If anything, they're moving the other way, which is to imagine territory that is currently Gaza being a buffer zone, a security zone for Israel. Maybe you'll react to that. But I just wanted to ask a couple of other things which are almost premises for your plan, which is not your plan, but for your envisaging of a solution. One is that Hamas is gone, and that then a revitalized Palestinian Authority steps into the breach, not just in Gaza, but in terms of Palestinian leadership. And I'm bound to ask, do you see evidence of either of those things? Of Hamas being gone? Yes, militarily they've taken a big hit, but gone? And then similarly, a revitalized PA. I'm not myself seeing either of those things.
Well, this is a point I've been making from the very beginning, Johnny, which is that I've never seen a country fight a war like Israel's fought a war in Gaza, where you go in, you dismantle and destroy the other army, and then you do not assume responsibility for the territory. Then you leave. The remnants of that army emerge, reconstitute themselves. Then you come in again and you fight and dismantle more. And then you leave again. And each time you destroy more and more of the area. You keep certain roads and whatnot, but then you leave again. Then the world tells you got to bring in humanitarian trucks. The trucks go in and are immediately looted because there's no military authority, yours. And winter's coming. It's one of the craziest damn things I've ever seen. And it comes from a government that refuses to have a plan for the morning after. Because of political reasons, it's got elements in it who actually want to resettle Gaza and believe there is something like a total victory. Can I just remind people, I just checked my calendar, it is 2024. Israel has been in the West Bank for 57 years with a full military occupation. And it still hasn't got that under military control. So the idea that there is a total victory in Gaza for that, with no control, I just think it's the damnedest thing I've ever seen.
When you look at, obviously, this administration, the incoming administration is different in so many ways from the Biden administration. I found it really interesting, for example, that the Senate Majority Leader-elect said this week, reinforcements are on the way to Israel as a way to criticize the Democrats, of course. The interesting thing, and a friend of mine pointed this out to me, he said, look at all of the responses to what he said on Twitter. All of them were America first. You promised America first. What are you talking about when you mean reinforcements? So I'm wondering what you think about that. Does the right-wing government here in Israel that imagines this heaven on earth the minute the clock strikes on January 20th and Trump is president, is that what they will indeed receive in that regard? Because obviously they would read what I think Netanyahu thinks is that the Trump administration will give him everything he needs and anything he wants to continue this war.
Well, all of this fits into a category, Yonit, that I call loving Israel to death. That's what these guys will do. Or I would say there's an impulse within the Republican Party to love Israel to death. Whatever you want, you got it. You want the West Bank, you want Gaza, you want weapons, you want cover, you want judicial coup. No problem. We love you. We love you more than Democrats. And we're going to love you to death. So I think that's a real concern. The other is that I have two words for you, Tucker Carlson. And if you don't like those two words, they're, J.D. Vance. These guys are isolationists. Israel's 10-year security deal with the United States, signed by that vicious, Jew-hating Barack Obama, $40 billion over 10 years, is what Obama left Israel. That's about to expire. And I'll tell you, renegotiating that at the 40 billion number, there's going to be a real clash within that party over that. So you have in that party real isolationists, bordering on some of them not being lovers of Zion and the Jewish people, let's put it that way. And then you have traditional Republican internationalists, and then you have the Christian element who call the West Bank Judea and Samaria, and they will love you to death. They will love you to death.
It's a very important point, this, that the Republican Party is no monolith, but also this odd exceptionalism at the moment, which has held together, which is they're America first, isolationist with this one carve-out clause for Israel. And it is a question about how sustainable that is long-term, how long the J.D. Vances and so on put up with it. But let's say... Can
I just jump in? Can I be the Israeli and jump in and say that there are many Israelis who would listen to what you're saying and saying loving me to death is still better than parts of the Democratic Party just plainly sounding like they hate me.
That's true. Or being the friend who doesn't let you drive drunk.
I mean, a little bit different in colors, though. I mean, there are parts that what you're saying is actually saving me, right? But I was mentioning the sort of
But
far,
I think you're making a good point.
that
Yeah,
is
it's a very
different.
good point, Yonit. And it's and that what I worry about is that rather than being the friend who says, you know what, I'm calling an Uber for you, I'm not letting you drive in that condition, he actually pours you a few more drinks and says, l'chaim, 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 and we're just gonna drink some more.
Related to that, if Trump were to go for the plan, as you've outlined in this latest column, do you think your read, because I know you've just come back from Israel, you've met lots of people there, what's your read of whether or not Netanyahu would go for it? His fingerprints were on the last one, as you pointed out. How would he respond this time, given the coalition he leads has a different makeup from last time we went round this? He's in, the sort of box he's in is differently constructed now. What's your read of that end of it?
It's an important question, Johnny, and I would just say, and it goes to Yonit's point too, I repeat, none of this should even be introduced until there's a ceasefire and the hostages are returned. Because I don't think you can have any kind of serious conversation until that core trauma has at least been capped. And only then, I think, can you have a really serious debate in Israel.
How because we've been hearing all kinds of contradicting things, and you're the person to answer this. How involved is Jared Kushner in Trump presidency number 2?
Well, Jared has gone into business. He has a big fund in which he's raised money from Arab Gulf states, notably Saudi Arabia, and made investments, I believe, in Israel too, already, or was contemplating them. People can check that, but. And we actually have laws. We still are a nation of laws. Last time I checked, I don't know for how long. And so there are real laws about like people doing business there and then being in the government. And Jared will have to be, and I'm sure will be wise to that, respectful of it. But I think his role will be one as an outside coach. I mean, he is the son-in-law of the president elect. But I think he'll play a role in appointing people. Who Trump chooses for key positions. And the key positions on this issue, I would say I'd like to know who's going to be the NSC director for Middle East. Who is the U.S. ambassador in Israel is irrelevant. That person will play no role whatsoever. To mix metaphors here, Trump's appointed a lot of people and some Jewish real estate developer from New York, I don't know who any of these people are. And the idea that they're going to, be taken seriously by Netanyahu. Netanyahu eats those kind of people for breakfast, let alone Hezbollah or the Saudis. So I look at them as kind of baubles, again, to mix metaphors, on a Christmas tree. Trump decorates his trees, but the minute he wants to do something, he'll shake that tree and they'll all fall off. And Donald Trump will do whatever Donald Trump wants to do with his Secretary of State or his National Security Advisor. So I wouldn't take any of this seriously at all. And I'd wait to see, who gets that NSC position on the Middle East, who's Near East director in the State Department. I think those will matter a lot more. You
talk about him shaking the tree and often surprising people, Donald Trump. Is it on a scale of sort of unlikely to you never know? Where do you put the scenario of Donald Trump sort of shocking everyone and doing with the supreme leader of Iran what he did with Kim Jong-un of North Korea and saying, I'm going to break every taboo, I'm going to meet this guy, let's cut a deal?
Yeah, I think you have to fasten your seatbelt and put your seat back and tray table into a fixed upright position because he is capable of absolutely anything. And whatever scenario you can imagine, he is capable of. What you see him doing in domestic politics, he can as easily appoint Matt Gaetz, an alleged, someone who has had sexual relations with a 17-year-old minor, as he can tell President Macron to set up a bilat with the supreme leader of Iran in Geneva. The tail risk of this administration, or call it tail opportunity, are just wider than you can possibly imagine.
So if you had chips in the casino, you'd put half of them on Trump attacking Iran and half of them on deal with Iran, basically?
That's a good way to put it, Yonit, yeah. Either one is equally plausible, and some on nothing, not doing anything, but talking a lot.
So let's go to the American environment. Politically, obviously, the Democrats have taken this big defeat. There is a whole internal conversation going on among Democrats about whether that was a price paid, because they had gone, they were associated with the left in the public mind, the left saying, no, we weren't left-wing enough. That's why we lost, Arab votes in Michigan. Yonit and I have talked about that round and round. But just what's your sense of where the politics of this issue is in the United States, and particularly what that means for American Jews? And I know some of the worries you have about that.
Yeah, look, my great fear with this Netanyahu government is I'm someone who was raised during the phase of the heroic Israel. My journalism career corresponded with the peace process Israel. And my great fear is that I will go out with the pariah Israel, that I will live to see what it means to be a Jew in the modern world when the Jewish state is a pariah. I don't predict that. I don't hope for it. But I think it's a real possibility with the government that it has. I think that would be a terrible danger for Israel's relations with the world, and obviously Israel's relations with Jewry all over the world. Look, you can already see what's happening with the next generation of American Jews, and they, at best, they just sort of pull back from the issue of Israel because they find it very hard to explain to their friends, and even to themselves. And they aren't schooled in it in the way that I was as someone who grew up with this issue. And at worst, they're hostile. And I think it's a generational thing, but I think it'll be very dangerous for Israel. And I hope we don't get there. And everything I'm writing is advocating, two states for two people, because I believe that's the only way out of this. And I know it's not going to be easy. It's certainly not going to happen overnight, and certainly not going to even begin to happen until there is a ceasefire and a hostage release and some kind of stability in Gaza. But somebody's got to be advocating this. And at a time when no one else is, it really feels, watching Israeli politics, that Netanyahu is in everybody's head, in all the opposition leaders' head. Everyone sort of thinks like, well, if I say this, then Bibi's poison machine will say that. And if I say that, then they'll say this. And let me make it very clear. Bibi Netanyahu is not in my head. And I hope I'm in his head. I can't say if I am, but he is not in my head. He doesn't determine what I say and what I advocate. And I'm going to keep doing this. And that's the first column I wrote about Trump, was putting that idea out there, because I think it's really important.
Look, we all share that fear that Israel becomes a pariah state. I think part of it could be attributed, particularly the tragic paradox of that happening after it being attacked so viciously and monstrously. But, part of that could be attributed to the Netanyahu government. And part of it, we're not going to talk percentages, but part of it is definitely the way in which Israel is portrayed in the world. And we can go, that's a whole separate conversation. But I assume, you've heard a lot.
I totally agree. Again, if you're been reading me, I don't let Hamas off for an inch. I hope they're defeated. But to be defeated, they have to be replaced. That's what they have to be replaced with something better. The aspiration is not going to go away for Palestinians. So Hamas is terrible. First and foremost, it's been terrible for Palestinians, and then second, and it's been terrible for Israelis. I have a particular beef with them because, as we've talked before, I was the one who produced the Saudi Peace Initiative back in 2002. From Crown Prince Abdullah. It was an interview that I did, and that then was adopted by the Arab League in March 22, 23, I believe, if I have my dates right, at an Arab League summit in Beirut. And what did Hamas do on the evening of March 22, on the evening of the first day of the Arab League summit, to adopt the first Arab peace plan for two states in the Middle East and offer peace with every Arab state in response if Israel rose to that opportunity? Hamas blew up a Passover Seder in Netanya. I don't think it's funny, these people on these college campuses supporting them, and glory to the revolution and glory to the martyrs. All of that is obnoxious. It is not, in my view, in the interest of peace or the Palestinian people. If you have a peace plan, if you have a chant at your march that takes you 15 minutes to explain why it doesn't mean what it obviously means, 2 states for 2 people, then you need another chant. Let me suggest one. 2 states for 2 people. I don't need anyone to interpret that for me. So I have no illusions about them. I have a whole agenda with them, but we're not on their blog. We're not on their podcast right now. And I'm not afraid to take them on at all. And I do.
But generally, I mean, you have heard, I assume, over the years and particularly over this year, reinforced the criticism that says that your own paper has been, suffering from an anti-Israel bias. I wonder, what you say to people who I assume come up to you because you are the most famous person in that building.
I'm always very clear. First of all, I love my paper, and I think they've really done a great job on a really hard story. So for the record, that's my answer. But I also just don't answer for the New York Times. I answer for my own column. Like if someone has a critique of my column, I'm very happy to respond to a specific critique. But what happens in these stories, and I've been doing this for a long time, but since the Lebanon war, is that we were the first ones to do a huge takeout on the rape question, proving that, rape happened. I mean, we've done a lot of, I think, really important stories. And I'm sure there are stories that we've done that people feel were unfair. It's the nature of these things. But you have to be very specific for me. Hey, this story in this context, why did you write that? It was wrong. Here's the proof. That I'm happy to talk about. But for my own column, but I can't do it for the paper because I don't speak for I'm not on the news side of the paper. So I think we do a great job in general, and I love my paper, and but I in these emotional stories, I understand on both sides, because believe me, we get it from if you think Jews think we're biased, you should listen to what, Arab Americans think of us. They think we're Israel Hayom, so that's just in the nature of these things.
You slightly less chantable, but the formulation I've noticed you use now, and it's changed, is you now use the formulation 2 states for 2 indigenous peoples. For whom are you adding that extra word, Tom?
For anyone who's listening who doesn't think that both of these people have a deep and long commitment and claim to this land. And if you think, what I say to anyone, if you think this is the Belgian Congo for the Jews, then tell me where their Belgium is. Where are they going to go back to, And the Jewish claim to this territory is deep and abiding. The Palestinian claim is as well. Each one starts and stops at different times. And I am not going to get into the debate about who has a superior claim. To me, they both do. And that's why I insist on speaking about 2 states for 2 indigenous people, because both have deep roots in the land.
Yeah, and you're pushing back there a bit against the sort of anti-colonialism narrative that says Israel's a settler colonial state. You're saying Jews are indigenous to this land.
That they are not indigenous to this place and haven't had an unbroken connection to this land, sometimes big, sometimes small, but always unbroken. Again, that's my problem with the other side, of this debate. I'm just not interested in your, in these claims. The only way we're going to get progress is if we start with the fact that these are 2 people who claim this land. Somehow they've got to find a way to share it in a way that is stable. And if they can't, the alternative is not going to be a 1-state solution. The alternative is going to be no state for 2 people. Not 2 states for 2 people, not 1 state. It's actually going to be no states for 2 people. If you were to look at a real heat map of Israel today, that is one of those that are taken from space about where the lights are, what you will notice is that Israel today, given the bite that Hezbollah has taken out of the north and the bite that Hamas has taken out of the west, Israel today, and the places in the West Bank that are now no-go zones, Israel today looks remarkably like the 1947 UN partition map.
Tom Friedman, Pulitzer Prize winner, New York Times staple. We are so grateful to you. Thank you once again for being with us on Unholy.
Anytime.
I think it really is important to stress you can argue with his opinions, but not to doubt his motivations. He deeply cares about Israel. I think that has been like a constant of of Tom Friedman's career. And that is where he always speaks from that point of view. That is, I'm, worried about Israel's future. This is what I envision for that future. And as I said, you can push back on that. But the point that we kind of need to always remember is just the fact that he really cares about this country. Completely.
And he's been very, very consistent. And, in the 90s, he was a very sort of centrist, mainstream voice, even within the Israeli context. He's more or less, he has stayed where he is. Just the actual spectrum itself has shifted. So now he can sound like a more radical voice. But I think he's stayed where he is. I think the important thing as well, and he deserves great credit for it, he says, I'm here to talk about solutions, not the problem. If you want to go through the problem and detail all the terrible things, this side of down or that side of down, or go through the history and who started it, go to someone else. But all I'm focused on is how we might get out of this. And that's true, again, of his journalism, and has been for many decades. It doesn't win you, necessarily friends all the time doing that, because it's very easy. It's much easier to go, oh, that will never work. But he keeps at it. Last thing perhaps to say is I think you read his column, it's meant for an audience of millions, which he has, but it is also very clearly for an audience of one or possibly two. He is writing that latest column for Donald Trump and also for Netanyahu, saying, he knows them both. Here's what you could do. And he is read in those places, and therefore his interventions do matter. So great to have Tom Friedman on the podcast.
Indeed. We have an interesting gift for unholy listeners this week. We should tell our listeners that Ilana Dayan, who's a legend of Israeli broadcasting, has been on this podcast numerous times, a cherished friend of ours. She gave a speech last week. She received an honorary doctorate from the highly prestigious Weizmann Institute in Israel. And we thought that her speech was important, not only about the importance of journalism in a democracy and trust and truth, but also about the unwillingness of the Netanyahu government to set up a commission of inquiry to investigate the failures of October 7th. And she talked about all that in her speech, which was originally given in Hebrew. We asked Ilana, and she generously agreed to translate this and give the speech, slightly edited version of it, in English. And I would also add, personally, if I may, Jonathan, these days when we talk a lot about the extreme factions of the Israeli government, like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and when the ICC issues its warrants and sees a specific picture of Israel, Ilana is Israel in many ways. Obviously, she's unique in paraphrasing and her own words, but this is Israel, and the voice you're listening and the, I think, centrality and importance of what she's saying, there are many, many in Israel who would agree with that. So this is, I think, an important part of listening to what she has to say. So slightly unusual for us to do this, but here it is, a speech by Ilana Dayan.
We didn't know that it was possible to hurt like this. We didn't know that it was possible to be kidnapped, to be raped like this. We didn't know it was possible to be abandoned, to die like this. What happened to us on that Shabbat was so far beyond the limits of our imagination that for the past year and 1 month, we have been searching for words. I am not sure that I have the precise words, but maybe I can manage to phrase the questions that we urgently need to ask, all of them, now. And that is essentially what I wish to say out of the love for the profession I chose, which has become my mission, out of a simple love for this country, out of my deep connection to this land and its people. We must ask the questions, both to try to get answers, but mainly to make sure that we never stop asking, because there is no revival for a place where even the questions are dead, because what has been broken here must be fixed. And to fix it, we need to know. And to know, we need to ask. The act of questioning is therefore the patriotic act these days, and it is not unnecessary to say this. The father of Hadar Cohen, a female observer soldier who fell at Nahal Oz, did just that about a month ago during the National Memorial Ceremony, when he stood on stage and said with a broken voice, the blood of our daughters cries out to us from the earth. We will not forget and we will not tire. With the last ounce of strength, we will ensure that those responsible assume their responsibility. I saw him with tears in my eyes, and I understood. Of all the sins of those responsible for the disaster, of all the failures of the leaders who survived the disaster, there is no explanation for the sin of refusing to establish a state commission of inquiry, which would simply ask and investigate the most terrible disaster that fell upon us. I ask you, how can one replace a defense minister during a war but not set up a state commission of inquiry, the one tool that the law regulates and the public insists must be established to ask questions and get answers? How come that is not happening 1 year and 1 month after the biggest fiasco this country has ever seen? I checked. The Agranat Commission was established on November 21st, 1973, a month and a half after the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, which it was established to investigate. The Kahan Commission was established on November 1st, 1982, a month and a half after the massacre at the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, which it was appointed to investigate. The Or Commission was established on November 8, 2000, a month and a week after the riots in the Galilee, which it was appointed to investigate. The Shamgar Commission was established on November 8, 1995, 4 days after the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, which it was appointed to investigate. The refusal to establish a commission of inquiry to investigate how the catastrophe of October 7th occurred reduces with every passing day the chance of discovering the facts, unearthing the truth, and restoring public trust in those who make life and death decisions. You might well ask, of all the scandals and displays of indifference around us, why focus on this question? Because of the stubborn and cynical refusal, and because this refusal is not accidental, and mainly because it undermines the two pillars without which there will be no healthy and free society here. Those are truth and trust. Truth is the result of finding the facts and agreeing that these are indeed the facts. And trust in those who mediate those facts to us. Sometimes it's the scientist, sometimes the police officer or investigator, sometimes it is the reporter. We are supposed to rely on the mediators to supply the information, and we are supposed to trust the decision makers to use this information for the common good. You cannot know without trusting, and you cannot trust without knowing. Truth and trust. Every scientist here knows that you cannot perform research without believing in the existence of facts, which in turn create a truth that we can all believe in and rely on its agents. Granted, not all facts are created in laboratory conditions. Sometimes reality is in the eyes of the beholder. But in my years of work as a reporter, I have learned that much to the dismay of postmodernists, in the end, there are facts. The time now is 6:32 in the evening, and we are in Rehovot. The time was 6:29 when thousands of terrorists flooded the Gaza border. 6:39 when they raided Nir Oz. 6:56 when they reached Be'eri. 9 a.m. when the first IDF soldiers arrived at the kibbutz, suffered injuries, and pulled back. 1:30 p.m. when an organized IDF force finally began fighting in the kibbutz. 102 people were murdered at Be'eri and 30 were kidnapped. Those are facts, lean and hard facts. So don't let the noise of there is no absolute truth confuse you. And more importantly, when truth is destroyed and trust is shattered, it doesn't happen accidentally. One cannot understand what happened to us on October 7th without understanding how truth and trust were shattered here, both in the month leading up to that Shabbat and after that Shabbat. No commission of inquiry that tries to investigate what happened to us that very Shabbat, what happened the night before at 8200 intelligence unit, or why wasn't there a single soldier in Nir Oz when the terrorists were murdering and kidnapping a quarter of the kibbutz, or how they reached Ofakim. No such commission investigating the October 7th events will help unless we understand what happened here until October 6th and what is still happening. Israeli society reached October 7th divided and fragmented. More accurately, someone worked on dividing us, also through the judicial reform, which millions of Israelis saw as an attack on our democracy, the targets of which were carefully and clearly marked. The Supreme Court, the Attorney General, the civil service, the free press, almost all the gatekeepers were marked, and with them, the pillars of truth and trust. It goes hand in hand, the destruction of trust in the gatekeepers and the destruction of truth, with a mighty and lethal tool that is just a touch away on our mobile screen, social media, the place where truth died and facts lost to traffic. In fact, the facts were cancelled. When someone uploads a photo of allegedly post-riot Ben Gurion terminal the day after the protest arrived there, it's not difficult to prove that this photo was taken in Brussels 20 years ago. When someone spreads wild slanders about a Shin Bet officer who is married to a prominent figure, it is not difficult to prove that he did not meet Yahya Sinwar days before the massacre. The truth is that he fought bravely in Gaza during the last year. It is not difficult to prove, but no one cares about the proof. As someone once said, while the truth is putting its shoes on, lie can travel halfway around the world. And not just lie, also malice. That's how the pipeline works online. Everything extreme becomes viral, and everything hateful catches like a wildfire in a field of lies, because the lie is the virus and the web is its carrier. Almost every one of us find themselves trapped in an echo chamber that reverberates what the algorithm has identified as what we want to hear. Check out how many people believe that Ehud Barak hopes that hundreds of bodies will float in the Yarkon River so that they will call him back to lead, despite him saying the opposite. How many people are sure that Aharon Barak is the demon because of whom the Supreme Court allowed October 7th, despite the fact that this wise man has not been on the bench for 18 years now? Yes, these echo chambers produce half-truths, repel noises that create healthy doubt, but they do also something else. The rival becomes a one-dimensional figure, essentially a target to shoot poisoned arrows at. The rival is the other, faceless and devoid of human dimension. Think of it. The man who won the elections in America on November 5th lost 4 years ago, and shocking facts came out about his role in inciting the Capitol riots. The 76 million Americans who voted for him now didn't really care. And those who stormed the Capitol on his behalf then were sure that really Trump won the elections and Biden really lost the elections and stole them. That's what they were told in their feed. The people who were there to certify the results, senators, law enforcement officers, were all stormed by a mob washed with lies and blinded by hatred, because the facts have been destroyed and trust has been shattered. And the people on that hill ceased to be seen as human. They were the enemy from within. There is no more we the people. No, we have therefore gathered around shared truths and common goals. Instead, there is an enemy from within. Sometimes it is called the deep state. Sometimes it's anarchists or kaplanists who would be accused of insubordination and betrayal of the nation. The dynamic, make no mistake, this dynamic is double-sided. What works from right to left sometimes happens from left to right as well. The liberal side also knows how to label, condescend, cancel, and hate, and how quickly legitimate opposition to a hostage deal or support for maximizing the war achievements earns you an entry ticket to the cult of death, and how every religious person becomes a messianic figure, every prayer in the town square becomes a threat, and every attempt at reconciliation becomes a crime. No, I'm not trying to arrange an unholy balance here or some false symmetry. I'm trying to unravel the web of lies and hatred closing in on us. One that briefly seemed to unravel when the war broke out and the bickering paused due to the emergency situation. But the pause was brief and the quarrel resumed. So what do we do when the cannons go silent and hostilities are back to haunt us? Here's a possible formula. It might not be mathematically proven in any faculty of yours, but it could still work. Everything is up for debate except for anything that will shatter the possibility of the debate itself. It is okay, it is legitimate, it's even desirable to argue passionately for or against a hostage deal, occupation, annexation, settlements in the Gaza Strip, even a two-state solution. This free-flowing, robust, open discourse which consumes information and produces it, which delivers truth and nurtures trust, which we, journalists, are supposed to fuel with facts, criticism, and question marks. This discourse is the lifeline of a democratic society. It has costs, that's true. It is not fun to hear difficult questions when everyone wants that we will win together. So when we got hold of emails written by a female sergeant in the intelligence unit 8200 warning of a Hamas attack before October 7th, we asked ourselves when and how to publish. But we replied that it was our duty to publish because blindness might be comforting, but it's extremely dangerous. Therefore, almost everything is permissible, almost always. Everything except harming the mechanisms that ensure discourse itself and endangering the gatekeepers who protect our basic freedoms, including the freedom to ask questions. Without those gatekeepers, the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, a free press, even a defense minister who is not a yes man, there would be no one to stop the tyranny of a powerful leader or a power-hungry government. Without them, we are left with a hollow democracy, anorexic even, with perhaps elections, but no freedom, essence, truth, or trust. That's why this part of the Israeli debate is, in my view, not symmetrical. There is right and wrong, and there are things that are dangerous and destructive. This is why the flags that were raised here until October 6th are critical after October 8th as well, and perhaps even more so, because they are supposed to ensure not just our physical survival, but a life worth living, a life of a free people in their land. Am Chofshi Be'artzo. The writer Edgar Keret once told of his mother, a Holocaust survivor. She lost her entire family in the camps and was left alone in the world at the age of 8. When Edgar was about 5, she took him to lunch at a Tel Aviv cafe. He was cranky, and she told him, "Look, Edgar, there are many people around us holding forks and knives, and none of them intend to kill us. Let's call it a good day. In a way, this is the most accurate definition of Zionism. It saved us from those who persecuted and murdered us. The author Amos Oz explained it simply: Zionism aimed to bring us to a place where we stop dying and start living. And it succeeded. Israel won 7 wars. It will ultimately win this one too. The Zionist dream has been realized in the most basic sense. Every dream ceases to be flawless when it becomes reality. Anyone who ever got married knows it. Zionism could rescue us from pogroms and guarantee that we would stop dying. It cannot guarantee we will start living full, sane, really democratic lives. This is the second level that must be built atop the foundation of the Zionist dream. This, in my view, is our generation's mission and that of our children. From the depth of my heart, out of that great love for this place, I know that we must not give up on this second level. Indeed, it is less self-evident than the foundational level, because this second level requires asking tough questions. Asking, for instance, where exactly this war is going, how a hostage deal was torpedoed, and whether it is possible that someone in the Prime Minister's service stole and leaked classified documents to deflect pressure on the Prime Minister to get back the hostages. Yes, the scale of the tragedy in Gaza must also be questioned, and the fate of innocent civilians in Gaza who are dying in this war. Hamas brought this disaster upon them, but we will also have to live with its results, with our reflection in the mirror, and with our values we will have to live. The same values housed in this second non-trivial level. For me, it is clear that as journalists we have a role in maintaining this second level, simply because that's what we do. We ask questions all the time. This role was ever so clear to me when I sat with 2 senior members of the hostages negotiating team. Both took a risk in agreeing to meet with my colleague Naama Peri and I. Both burned with frustration when describing hostages whose time has run out, and the moment when they realized that someone high up did not truly want a deal. It is okay, of course, to oppose a deal at all costs, but it is not okay to believe those who say we will do everything while doing otherwise. Our role was as clear to me when we heard a phone conversation between Dr. Tamar Schlesinger and Michael and Amalia, the young children hiding in a closet in the safe room in their home in Kibbutz Kfar Aza. Their parents were murdered. Their sister Abigail was kidnapped. And Dr. Tamar, a clinical social worker, promised them she wouldn't leave them until the soldiers arrived. And it took them so long to arrive. And Tamar took care of Michael and Amalia on the phone for almost 12 hours. When we broadcasted those recordings, I understood once again something about our role: to shine light on moments of grace, but also to expose the horrors and keep asking the questions. These questions, my friends, are not just about the questions themselves. They are the idea of casting doubt. At times they embody suspicion. They are the act of challenging. They are democracy's state of being. We must ask in order to know to understand, and understand to choose. Certainly in a state whose emergency status can create pretexts for silencing and excuses for weakening all mechanisms of scrutiny and gatekeeping. Look at how the police is collapsing, how those in power try to intimidate the Attorney General, how academia is under attack, how clear and obvious the governmental effort is to harm those who question and seek to investigate and try to know more. So, is there a light blinking from anywhere in the future? I had the privilege of looking into the future this year through the eyes of our daughter's firstborn. His name is Adam, and he is half a year old. One great-grandfather of his was born in Argentina after his parents fled Ukraine. One great-grandmother of Adam was born in Uruguay after her parents fled Hungary, and most of their family perished there in the Holocaust. One grandfather of Adam was born in 1948 and fought in the 6 Days War. The other grandfather was an armored corps officer in the First Lebanon War. Adam's mother was also an armored corps officer, as was his father, who was seriously injured during Operation Protective Edge in 2014. When Adam was in the womb, his father was fighting as a reservist in Khan Yunis. When Adam was born, Israel was still at war. This war will end one day in a victory. There is a victory photo, and there will be more. But in my victory photo, I see Adam wearing shorts, riding a bicycle on a trail near Be'eri, or in the green fields between Nirim and Nir Oz, coming across a memorial or an old sign and asking what exactly happened there in that October. Someone will tell him about the tragedy, but also how we rose from it, how we turned a moment of fracture into a moment of grace, how we made sure to ask what happened and to ensure it never happens again. Neither the tragedy from without nor that from within. I'm dying to meet Adam at 20-something, not just because he will be devastatingly handsome. Also, who knows, maybe he will break tradition and never climb on a tank. But there's one promise we owe Adam and his generation, that we will ensure the second floor of this house where he can live for his country, not just die for it. It sounds far-fetched, I know. But anyone who heard Dr. Tamar on the phone with Michael and Amalia, anyone who witnessed all those who rose to the occasion this year with or without uniforms, knows there is room for optimism and hope. I cannot promise it, but I hope that Adam grows up in a more sane, inclusive, Jewish and democratic state. He may have to fight for it after all, but I wish he never stops asking. One last word. There are 101 sisters and brothers of ours still held hostages in Gaza. They all have loved ones who are waiting for them. We should ask, not only pray, we should demand and take action so that they all come back now. Thank you all very much.
Very soon after she gave that speech, you sent me the text of it and just said, just read this. And actually 3 or 4 other people did the same, like, brace yourself. This is
But I was first, right?
You were first. And okay. But the point is that people were really struck by it. And you can, I hope people can hear why. I mean, she mentions Amos Oz in there, who everyone knows I sort of revere. She has something of his kind of gravity when she speaks, I think. And she manages to say these things in a very kind of Jewish tradition. There is something of the sort of prophetic tradition in how she writes about questioning. And sometimes it's not just journalistic. There's something sort of poetic. It's not only journalistic. It is sort of poetic how she writes about these things. And I think the ability in the climate she's in as well to keep in her mind, all the different sort of humanities that are involved here. She closes with the thought of the hostages there in her mind. She's thinking about her audience. She finds room to talk about, the innocent Gazans who are dying in this war. She talks about them and says, we are going to have to live with the results and our reflection in the mirror. These are not easy things to say for somebody in her position. And she says them very, very beautifully. So that's why we made this quite unusual move, I think. We haven't ever done that before, for somebody to be on uninterrupted by either you or me, uninterrogated, because we just wanted to let people hear what you and I had both heard and had been very sort of struck by.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That is why, as you said, she phrases it better than most of us, but I think she speaks for many of us. So that is why it was important for us to bring it to the foreground and to unholy listeners. We have some awards, and it was a pretty long show, but we still have tradition to maintain, sir. So you start.
We do. I thought I would, partly just because we hadn't yet got fully in on all the nominations that Donald Trump is making that are blowing people away. I did have to answer questions from a couple of friends. Is Matt Gaetz Jewish? No, he's not. He's got a T and a Z in his name, but that doesn't mean he's Jewish. Our chutzpah award would go this week, I think, to it could go either to the artist who did this artwork or to the person who bought it. You decide. Maurizio Catalan's viral artwork, which involves a banana duct taped to a wall, has just sold at auction for $5.2 million. I kid you not, the work is called Comedian. It was sold at Sotheby's in New York as part of an auction on contemporary art. The bidding was very, very fast. The auctioneer said, I never thought I'd save $5 million for a banana. Apparently the banana in question, the one displayed, had been bought for 35 cents earlier that day. The collector who bought it is a Chinese-born crypto entrepreneur. He paid this $6.2 million overall because he had to pay a buyer's premium. And in return, this is what he's going to get: a banana, a roll of duct tape, and a certificate of authenticity and instructions on how to install the work, including how you are to replace the banana should you want to. Apparently, the buyer said he plans to eat the banana as a way of honouring its place in both art history and popular culture. Now, we can both think, can't we, of lots of things you could spend $6.2 million on rather than a piece of duct tape and a banana, taping the banana to the wall. Is it the artist? Is it the buyer?
Definitely in the wrong profession. That is my, conclusion from the story.
Can you imagine? So I don't know which one of those two we think gets the chutzpah award. Maybe it's the banana itself for having the sheer gall to think it's worth $6 million. But there we are. That's our chutzpah story for this week.
And I will just tell our listeners that I'm cutting out all the places where you said banana, and I'm going to make that my ringtone for the week. Just that's it. Got to say that.
Banana, banana, banana. We've gone bananas.
All right, well, let's go to the Mensch award. And this week, I think we should talk about Moran Stella Yanai. She was at the Nova party. She was selling her jewelry, and she was kidnapped into Gaza. Really a remarkable woman, and the way that she tells her story from the moment that she was able to tell it. She returned to Israel in sadly, we should say, the only hostage deal that we have seen at the end of November and the beginning of December. And this week, some video emerged. Actually, it's from June, if I'm not mistaken, in which she is sitting in an event with a pro-Palestinian, and she explains to him, really as calmly as one can, what happened to her and her experiences. And she wasn't arguing or yelling or anything. She just tried to look him in the eye. By the way, he couldn't look her in the eye throughout these long minutes, and just telling him what she went through, the violence she experienced, the violence she saw, and what happened to her. And it was such a powerful thing, because really it's just the person and the power of truth and the power of evidence and what they can tell the world. And I think a lot of people reacted in that, just to think of really what this woman went through and how difficult it is to even put that in words. Definitely if it's not your first language. She was saying this all in English. And just standing and holding your ground in front of someone who's denying, your reality and what you lived through. And I think that is just remarkably brave.
Yeah, a good choice. We are at the end. This has been a bumper episode with two greats of our field in Ilana Dayan and Tom Friedman. So we are hugely grateful to them.
Indeed. And we will say our thank you to Michal Porat and remind you all that we're also on YouTube and Substack and X and
I think maybe on Blue Sky as well. I think we're coming.
Sky.
I think we're coming if we're not there yet.
That was your doing.
Yeah, and, I'm pushing that.
Yep.
That's
on
where
Holy
I've sort
Podcast on Instagram and on Facebook. We're all across the platforms. Jonathan's a crazy social media guy.
You know me.
I really do. And we'll meet next week.
We'll see you then.